right, hello everybody. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look a little bit at content, but mostly what we're going to do is we're going to focus on our very first historical thinking skill. So there's a variety of skills that historians use that the AP test wants us to learn, and one of them is called contextualization, and it's really the first step in understanding a historical event. So when we contextualize a historical event, we place it in its historical context. Pretty easy, right? Sounds exactly like what you think it is. And the reason why we do this is because understanding the context helps us understand that event. So especially if we're looking at something like cause and effect, understanding the context of an event can maybe give us some clues as to why something happened or where something came from. So the event that we're going to be looking at the next time I see you is the Renaissance. So we need to do some digging to find out what was happening a little bit before the Renaissance and how did that contribute to the development of the Renaissance. The way I think about contextualization is it's a lot like providing the backstory, right? So if you're watching a TV show, if you're watching a movie, if there's something that happened before the events of the TV show or the movie, and you need to know about it to understand that show or movie, the show or movie is probably going to tell you about it. So, for example, a lot of teachers will cite the opening crawl in Star Wars as contextualization. So it gives us some, basic background information about the world that we're about to watch a movie about. And I also think of like the little previously on bits that usually happen at the start of a TV show. So especially if it's got a very complicated plot and the TV show thinks you have perhaps forgotten the last episode, they'll give you some information about what happened previously so that you could understand the episode you're about to watch now. So, one strategy that makes contextualization a little bit easier is to break it down into different parts. So if I just said contextualize the Renaissance, contextualize the coronavirus pandemic of 2020, right? Well, there's a whole lot of stuff you can do right there. So let's break it down. How are we going to approach this? So one particular strategy that I really like is called Persia. So what we do is it's an acronym. We look at the political context of an event. So what was happening in terms of the government, of states, of kings and queens and presidents and princesses and whatnot, what's going on there? Next up is economic context. So what's happening with the economy? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it improving? Is it not? What's going on there? Then, of course, there's the religious context. One thing that's pretty interesting about this course, I think, is that the religious context is going to be very, very important at the beginning. We'll see a little bit of that today. But it's actually become less important as we go on, and we're going to see things like the political and economic context and social context become a little bit more important and the religious context decline. Next up is social context. You might remember, okay, well, what's that? Social context is pretty broad. It can have, or mostly has to do with things like social classes. So who are the elites in our society? Are they the rich? Are they the politically powerful? And then who's on the bottom? What people are the have-nots? Is it workers? Is it peasants? Is it something else? What's going on there? The social context can also have to do with things like gender and family roles. So how are women perceived? What is the role of women in this society? Or do we even think of gender as men and women, or is there another option there? So that can influence the context of an event as well. Then there's the intellectual context. So this has to do with like things like philosophy and science and all of that good stuff. So what are the intellectuals of our society? What are they doing? What are they thinking? How do they understand the world? And then finally, what's the artistic context of an event? What kinds of art are people producing? One of the main themes of this course is actually art and art history. And for those of you who have friends who took this course last year or the year before, you may know that our summer work used to have a lot to do with art, although we did not assign summer work this year, so you guys are off the hook there. So what we'll be doing throughout this course, whenever I ask you to contextualize an event, and believe me, this will appear on the AP exam in multiple ways, so we're going to be doing this a lot, is I might give you a little chart like the one you have in front of you now that lists the political, economic, religious, social, intellectual, and artistic context. All right, so let's talk about the actual context of the Renaissance, right? So the period before the Renaissance is called the late Middle Ages. So you probably know, I'm sure you've all seen TV shows that are set in the Middle Ages or read books or read fantasy novels that kind of take their cues from the Middle Ages. The time period's a little fuzzy. We start our course in 1450. But the Middle Ages actually started with the fall of Rome way, 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 way back when. But the Middle Ages is so long that it's kind of divided up into periods. And the period that we really want to be interested in, we don't really care so much about the really earlier stuff, the fall of Rome, Vikings, all that stuff. We're going to start in 1250. And this time period is generally known as a time of crisis and instability. Nothing is really going right for anybody in pretty much all of these Persia categories, more or less. So politically, during this time period, something called the 100 Years' War takes place. You really don't need to know that much about it. All you do need to know, really, is that it was between France and England. And what it ended up doing is leading to the development of strong centralized monarchies in France and England. So what exactly does that mean? Well, basically, what we're going to see is it's going to give power to the kings of France and England. And that's going to set the stage for a political trend that we're going to see develop really through the first half of this course. So we're going to see monarchies become more and more powerful. And this is going to get started in France and in England, and then it will spread elsewhere. You guys might remember from 7th grade, if you're like, wait a minute, why are we talking about France and England if we're talking about the Renaissance? Isn't the Renaissance all about Italy and Da Vinci and all the Ninja Turtles and whatnot? And the answer is yes. So Italy is pretty unusual, at least compared to France and England. So Italy is not unified, and actually it won't become a unified country until the 19th century, so the 1800s. So really recent in terms of the historical events of this course, right? But back during the late Middle Ages, so 1250 to 1450, that area abouts, Italy was made up of small city-states and had no centralized states. We'll be looking a little bit more at these when we talk about the political history of the Renaissance, so stay tuned for that. Elsewhere, so Central Europe, so today would be like the Czech Republic and Slovakia and Hungary and that area. And then as you can see, lovely typo there, the German states were not quite unified, but sort of. It's a little bit complicated. So all of these areas actually had their own governments for the most part. So if you're a state like what is today part of Germany called Bavaria, they had a king, for example. There were small city-states. Unlike Italy, these states were organized into one sort of central government called the Holy Roman Empire. You're like, hold up, the Holy Roman Empire. Roman Empire, that's in Italy, right? Well, Holy Roman Empire, one thing about European history is that everybody loves the Romans. So everyone's always trying to claim that they have they're descended from the Romans. They've inherited the heritage of the Romans. And so the Germans decided to do this in the Middle Ages. So this state that is in the middle of Europe is called the Holy Roman Empire. Nothing to do with the original Roman Empire. During this time period, it's there, but it's pretty disunified. There's a bunch of power struggles. All the various states and cities were constantly fighting with one another. So really the gist of it is we're seeing the developments of strong monarchies emerge in France and England, even though they've just emerged from this really chaotic war. But for the most part, Europe, isn't super unified, which I think is kind of interesting because I don't know about you, but I had this idea that back in the Middle Ages, it was all kings and queens fighting with each other, which not so much. It was pretty disorganized, actually. All right, economically, the European economy was based largely on agriculture, so farming, right? There were towns and cities, so places like Paris and London were already starting to develop, and you had small sort of middle classes or lower middle classes of merchants and artisans. Artisans were organized into groups called guilds, so this was the guild system, and we'll be talking about it a little bit more as we go on because it's going to decline over the period that we're going to talk about soon. And the 100 Years' War, so again between France and England, which I just mentioned, as well as the Black Death contributed to economic turmoil and peasant revolts. So I'm going to talk about the Black Death when we talk about social history, but what you need to know there, right, is it was a pandemic. So just like our class physically in real life is starting with a pandemic, so too is our content starting with a pandemic. Although the Black Death was significantly worse, you had people dying in the streets and it was extremely disgusting. I will come back to it when I mention social history, but suffice it to say, war and pandemics, as we know from reality right now, although we're dealing more with the pandemic than the war side, right? Not good for your economy. All right, let's talk about religion. So as I mentioned, religion is going to be very important at the beginning of our course, but decline a little bit as we go on. So in Western Europe, religion is dominated by the Roman Catholic Church. If you remember way back to middle school, you may remember that there was a schism earlier in the Middle Ages, and we got Eastern Europe is going to be dominated, Eastern Europe. So like Greece and Russia is going to be dominated by the Eastern Orthodox Church. We don't need to worry about them right now. They'll come back later. What we need to talk about really is the Roman Catholic Church because they're very, very important. So from now on, whenever I say the church with a capital C, that's going to be the Roman Catholic Church, right? And they're based, as the name implies, in Rome. So the Pope and other religious authorities held enormous political power as well as religious power. So again, this is something that's kind of an interesting theme at the beginning of our course, because we're going to see this change a lot. So right now, right, as I mentioned, there are kings and queens, there are princes and princesses who control states, right? But really, the ultimate power in Europe is the church. It is the Pope. So they're playing a very significant role in influencing those heads of state. They play a really important role in diplomacy, so in influencing relationships between the various countries and states. So they're very, very powerful. So if you imagine like a pyramid of the social hierarchy, they're at the very tip top of that pyramid. But that power is not going to last for very long. During this time period, there's another power struggle within the Catholic Church called the Great Schism. And there's two popes who compete with each other and try and be pope. And as you can imagine, that damages the credibility of the Catholic Church, right? Because if you're the Pope, you say, well, I'm the Pope. My interpretation of the Bible is completely correct. I have a direct phone call line to God, right? And if now there's two of you competing for that position, well, what does that say about your legitimacy? Is God somehow picking two of you at the same time? That seems a little bit unreasonable, right? Only one person can have this position at once. So if two people are vying for it, seems a little hinky. One thing that's really important to note about religion as well is that it plays a really significant role not just in politics, but really in everybody's daily life. So your entire yearly calendar is organized around the church. So maybe you have various festivals throughout the year and you look forward to those. We do it a little bit nowadays, right? So we organize our school year around religious holidays to an extent, which is kind of funny considering that in the United States we have separation of church and state. So we have Christmas break and Easter break and whatnot. So imagine that like dialed up to 11. And this picture there is actually from a Renaissance artist that we'll be talking about named Bruegel. And it shows a bunch of peasants enjoying their festival. All right. Socially, there's a lot to unpack here in terms of social class. So at the beginning of the late Middle Ages, this system called feudalism, you'll also see it called serfdom, is the dominant social system. So under this system, the person remember, the church is the very tippy top of society, but underneath him, right, or underneath them, excuse me, is the monarch, so the king or the queen, usually the king. And they're the central governing authority in our society, right, kind of like the president. And what they do is they own tons and tons of land, almost all the land, but they give some of that land to the next social class down, which is called the nobility or the aristocracy, and they protect the king, right? So they get land, and in exchange, they're like, okay, king, I will supply you with troops. I have all my knights and my vassals. You can use them if we go to war with France or whatnot, right? Then beneath the nobility / the aristocracy is the lower class. And that is mostly made up of peasants or serfs. Those things are a little bit different. We don't really need to get into the difference right now. It has to do with how free they are to move off the land. But generally, they're tied to the land. So they work that land that the nobles own that they got from the king. And they have a variety of other obligations. Sometimes they'll need to give the nobles food. Sometimes they'll give them money, various things like that. They pay taxes to them. But in exchange, it is kind of a two-way street. They receive protection from the nobles as well, right? So if an invading army comes into your land and you're a peasant, and your land gets burned to the ground, your nobles are going to protect you. They're going to help you out. So maybe the peasants aren't always happy with this situation because they're super poor and they're working the land and they pay all these feudal dues to the nobles, but there is something in it for them as well. Although much later down the line, come Christmas time in our class, that will change a little bit. All right. As I mentioned, right, the Black Death is going to be really important. It's one of the biggest events of this time period. And one of the reasons why it's important is not just because it was this very significant major disaster, right? Because it hit feudalism really, really hard. And it's going to lead to, or it's going to sort of kick off the decline of feudalism, which is a trend we're going to see in the first half of this class. So over a third of Europe's population died from the Black Death. It hit cities really bad. As you can imagine, cities were a little bit overcrowded. The sanitation wasn't great. This is way before we understood germs, right? So people had absolutely no idea what was causing the Black Death. They didn't know about sanitation. So they assumed it was because people weren't sufficiently godly. And they also blamed it on Jewish people. So anti-Semitism, there we go. It's another theme of our course that's going to become prominent. So many peasants died during the Black Death that did hit the countryside too. But so many peasants died that there ended up being a labor shortage, so there weren't enough peasants to work the land. And this actually helped them out. This is what helped lead to the decline of feudalism, right? Because what would happen was there were so few peasants, and the feudal lords needed somebody to work their land and harvest their crops, it kind of gave the peasants a hand up in negotiating, because they're like, well, we can use this to negotiate for better conditions. What we can do is we say, hey, feudal lord, if you don't pay me, if you don't reduce my feudal dues, well, I'm just going to walk off. And where are you going to find another peasant to work your land? That's right, you're not. So one of the biggest effects of the Black Death was leading to a decline in serfdom. All right, we're going to talk a little bit more next meeting about gender roles, but real quick, marriage during this time period was not about love. It was really about practical purposes. So you get married to your lady because she needs to help you work the land if you're a peasant. Or if you're from a noble family and maybe you want to make good with another noble family, maybe you hook your kids up. Marriage age was actually, we have this stereotype for some reason. It comes up a lot, and especially like fantasy media that's based on the Middle Ages, that people got married when they were like 12 years old, which is not really the case. Average marriage age was like 16, 18 to like mid 20s or so. In terms of leisure activities, you're like, why are we talking about leisure? This is something that comes up sometimes on the AP test. Rich people really enjoyed jousting and tournaments. So if you think like Ren Fair and knights and whatnot, they liked that. Leisure activities for the common people included drinking, that was popular, archery, wrestling, and bear baiting, which is exactly what it sounds and what you can see happening in this lovely illustration there. All right, so I actually grouped the intellectual and artistic context here just to make it a little bit easier. And this is actually something we're going to see change a lot in the Renaissance, so put a little pin in this. So the church was the primary intellectual authority. So what that means is if you are interested in whether, the sun moves around the earth, or what the planets are made out of, or how to be a good person, what you do is you don't figure this out for yourself. You don't go and read the Bible by yourself because you're a peasant, you probably can't read. You go to your priest, right? And he tells you what to believe. He interprets the Bible for you. So you don't do a lot of thinking on your own. You ask smarter people or people who are elites within your society. Not necessarily smarter. All right. One of the key figures during this time period, you might see this name pop up a little bit later, is Thomas Aquinas. And he was a Catholic priest and a philosopher. And he's really known for inventing this type of philosophy called scholasticism. And what's important about this philosophy is that it combined Catholicism with the philosophy of the Greek philosopher Aristotle. So something we'll talk about when we talk about the Renaissance, and this might ring a bell back from middle school, is that during the Renaissance, a lot of ancient Greek texts were rediscovered in Europe. You're like, wait a minute, what happened? Like, Greece is in Europe, where did all the texts go? Well, we'll find out what happened there in a little bit when we talk about the Renaissance, but not all the texts were lost. I think that's a common misconception. So some things remain. So maybe we forgot about Plato and some other guys, but we still had Aristotle. And so Catholics were pretty smart and well-educated. They could read, and they were reading Aristotle. And some of them tried to reconcile what they read in ancient Greek philosophy with what they learned, from their Bibles. Art was also really heavily focused on religious themes. I don't have one here that's about the Black Death. We'll talk about that in a second. But if you look at medieval art, you see a lot of pictures of baby Jesus. You see a lot of pictures of the Virgin Mary. So mostly, like, if you were an artist, you were painting religious subjects or doing woodcuts, et cetera, whatever medium you're working in. Something else you might notice, and we'll actually look at some medieval art a little bit later when we look at Renaissance art, it's very stylized and unrealistic. So the people don't really look like human beings. They look there's definitely a style there. They aren't realistic. It's not about representing the body realistically. The Black Death also really influenced art. As you can imagine, if everyone is dying in the streets around you, a third of your population has died, that's probably going to make you a little bit pessimistic about life, or make death feel a little bit closer. So especially in Northern Europe, especially in the German states, actually, as we'll see, there's a lot of art focused around themes of death. So there's something called like the Danse Macabre, which is not spelled at all like how it's pronounced. It's like the dance of death, which is what this woodcut here illustrates. So what I'd like you to do now, you have a little handout with you. If you were not filling it in as you were watching the video, make sure you fill it out now. And you're going to go through, by the way, these slides are also posted on Google Classroom. So if you're like, hold on, that was way too fast. They're there for you. And what you're going to do is you're going to fill out that little Persia chart and then submit it on Google Classroom. Thank you. Bye.